Hi, Misha here, and we're now to part 3, looking at Apollo. In part 1, we looked at the Saturn V, also the Saturn 1B. Part 2, we looked at the command module, the service module, the whole CSM. And now in part 3, we're going to talk about really the time on the moon itself, and the gear and men who did that. As always, if you could, do please like, share, and subscribe, because while I really enjoy doing these videos, obviously, it's always nice to get a little something out for the time, and it is time out of my day. I really should be working right now, but I just really wanted to talk about some astronauts. Not an uncommon thing for me. So let's just dive in. So this is where we left off. Well, nearly so. But last time we talked about the service module here. Now we're going to talk about the lunar module, originally known as the LIM. And it's always actually pronounced that, but it was originally known as the Lunar Excursion Module, later just abbreviated to Lunar Module, and how we get there. So, after making lunar orbit, and the commander and the lunar module pilot would get into the LIM, check everything out, reattach all the docking stuff because they might want to get back home one day, and then after preparing, they would separate. And they would actually do about a half-minute burn to get lower, down to about 50,000 feet. And then they're actually on their backs. We're going to talk about the inside in just a minute. Through subsequent burns, they would get down to 10,000 feet. And under 1,000 feet, they would start to pitch up. And then they would finally deploy the legs. Now, up to this point, it's pretty much computer controlled. The commander has the throttle and some maneuvering thrusters, and the named LM pilot, he's actually more of the navigator. He kind of monitors systems and just, reads off stuff, communicates. But it's mostly that. We've got 2 stages to this we'll talk about. There is one descent engine down here, and then there's a second ascent engine, because this base actually serves several purposes. So anyway, they would get down under 1,000 feet. They actually started off their approach about 260 miles uprange of their planned landing spot. But then they would get within a couple of thousand feet of it, and then they would actually start looking for boulders and what have you, because they didn't have exact data, especially on the original Apollo 11, July 20, 1969. So they had about 2 minutes of hovering fuel. Keep in mind, this is low gravity, but it's still gravity, so it's still being drawn in. And of course, as is famously known, they pretty much used up all their fuel in the first couple of missions. Although this would be changed for Apollo 14, but not actually using the LIM itself. Rather, the service module would dip down a bit, injecting it to a lower orbit, kind of a lower angle, meaning effectively it had more fuel to maneuver, and this helped quite a bit. But either way, they would get in there, the commander pretty much throttling and kind of navigating around, and they had contact probes on the legs, and when the probes hit, that was contact light came on, and that would tell the commander to, hey, turn off the engine if you even had fuel left. And hopefully they didn't teeter-totter on a rock or something and whatnot, because as you can imagine, the moon's not a solid surface, a smooth surface. And that's actually a good jumping off point to talk about the legs, because this 4-leg configuration was actually the third pattern they tried. because the LM had been in development since at least 1962. So let's go back in time. I also want to comment that these are the ones I have, the little models or toys of this. It's actually quite hard to find a limb, so I'm just happy. And of course, this one, like I said, is from the Space Voyagers thing. It's pretty good, but it doesn't have the ladder, but it does have the folding legs, and it does separate. But I do have a couple of others up here to show you, so let's talk about those and talk about some history. Here's a pretty neat one from Corgi Showcase. About 150 scale, maybe 140. They don't really scale these, but it is die cast, and it does separate. The bottom part is primarily plastic, but the top part is primarily metal, so it's got some good weight to it. And they did a pretty good job. Good little example piece. These are very inexpensive for what they are. So the development. Back in 1962, they weren't sure how they were going to do it. If they were going to do an Earth orbit, a lunar orbit, direct descent. That's when they picked the profile they would go with, and so they invited 11 firms to submit designs for this, or at least what would become this. This was to be the first true spacecraft. In other words, it could not operate in Earth's atmosphere or gravity. Of the 11 firms invited to submit designs, 9 would respond. That would be in September. They would start getting designs in. And then in late 62, early 63, the design from Grumman would be selected. Of course, they would go through a lot of changes, and Grumman would be the primary contractor, but there would be 4 major subcontractors and several subcontractors. Interestingly, TRW of M14 fame, who was actually making M14s at that very time, would be one of the 4 subcontractors of note. Bell of helicopter fame would also be one, which makes sense considering kind of what this was. Now, originally this was to be kind of a heavy, long stay, almost, base camp type craft. But that's when they thought they were going to send 2 Saturn V's up to get all the equipment for the mission. When they decided that they were going to only use one, part of it was just budgetary reasons, part of it was logistics. That's when things had to get lighter. So big windows were deleted, 2 docking ports and all that were down to 1. Even things like chairs, seats were deleted. Actually, when they were flying, they were on their backs but they were basically just held in with straps and just kind of there. And there were many other changes, including the legs. As we know, 4 here. Originally, they considered 3. That'd be very light, but that's a tripod, and unless you're my cat Peanut, tripods are very unstable. They also considered 5, much stabler, but more complexity for folding, unfolding 5 legs, also weight. So 4 was the compromise, which makes perfect sense. The general design and concept was frozen in 63, but they were still making changes through 66. For example, in 65, they were going to use kind of the same fuel cells that were in Gemini and would be in the Apollo CSM. Then they decided, no, we're just going to go with batteries. And so 6 batteries were used to power it. The engine needed to be throttleable on the descent stage. So a throttleable rocket engine is not the easiest. The ascent was a little more forgiving, because this would have to land and take off all on its own. When a Saturn V or any rocket leaves Earth, it's got a whole support crew. This would have none. Speaking of the mission, originally they always were going to have 2 astronauts in, but they were first just going to send 1 man out on the lunar surface, leaving 1 man inside to kind of give backup. He could monitor the vessel itself. He could relay communications between the man on the moon and either the CSM or NASA. But as things progressed, got more intelligent, this was scrapped. It was seen that we can get both guys on the moon automation will take care of itself. Also, NASA would monitor remotely using telemetry received from this, which is actually good. On one of the missions, they detected a leak in the oxygen when the astronauts slept. Either way, lots of changes were made. But the design we really know was finalized in 66. This is also when it went from being the LEM, Lunar Excursion Module, to just the LM, Lunar Module, although LEM was still often used as a name. And production began. Now, they would build 15 of these, and 10 would be launched. But early on, there were lots of issues, because this was a hugely different craft than man had ever made before, and frankly has ever made since. This is still the only craft to ever land on a foreign body with a crew on board and get them safely back home. So it took time. They were hoping to have the first unmanned test April of 67. It actually came with Apollo 5 in January of 68. They were hoping to have the first manned test in December of 68. That was to be in Earth orbit. Well, that was supposed to be on Apollo 8, or the mission that would have been Apollo 8. That got moved to March of 69 with Apollo 9. Another test was to be in kind of a dress rehearsals, it's called, lunar orbit, which would actually get down to about 47,000 feet above the surface, but it wasn't fully fueled, so they could not have landed and returned home. That was on Apollo 10. There was also to be another kind of mid-range test, but that was scrapped after Apollo 8 mission was successful, and it just was kind of felt like we don't really need it. There was also a backup. The LM2 was never needed, but it was a backup in case the test of LM1 failed. My point is, at the end, LM5 was the one that landed on the moon with Apollo 11 in the G-type mission. So, yeah. Dimensions. It's about 23 feet tall, not counting antenna. And it goes all the way out to 34 feet with its legs spread. Now, volume was about 235 feet. But habitable, pressurized up here, was only about 160, so kind of similar to Gemini. The rest of the volume was tanks, fuel, and equipment bays, because the descent stage also had several equipment bays for the stuff they would need on the moon, plus again, fuel, water, that kind of stuff. So dry weight on Earth for the original LEM was about 9,500 pounds, but loaded up with fuel and everything the astronauts would need, equipment, that ballooned to over 33,000, which is why the whole, lift thing had to happen with Saturn V. And that was, again, just the G-type original mission with Apollo landing on the moon. Here's a neat little coin-sized statue that someone sent me as a little gift. The guy plugs in, meant to be Neil Armstrong coming off. He looks to be about 1/30 scale. The A7L suit coming off the ladder of the LEM there. But yeah, they would land, they would hang out on the surface checking everything for up to 7 hours. Then Neil would come out, making his first step. Some question how there could be a picture of this. It's actually because in one of the equipment bays there was a lanyard attached, which he pulled on his way down the ladder, and that had a camera come out. And of course they would reenact things. Buzz Aldrin would join him about 20 minutes later on the surface, and he could always say, "Hey, do it again, Neil, and take a picture," because that's how things worked. But yeah, for the live broadcast, there was a camera off the descent pointed out. Of course, this was black and white early on. And they wouldn't actually be walking on the surface that long, about 2.5 hours. They would be on the total surface of the moon with the original LEM for under 22 hours. Although, from the get-go, this had enough oxygen, water, fuel, all that, for up to 48 hours. And once they were done checking everything, putting up the flag. This would separate, lift off. This acted as a platform to boost off of, having another engine. And this would come back up into orbit. It's worth pointing out this also acted as an abort stage. Anytime during the landing, if they couldn't find a proper site, they could just boost off this. Obviously, the mission's over, but they could just go back up to orbit. So, yeah, wasn't that big of a deal. The Space Voyager one does separate too. So this would go back up on its own thrust. And guys, if this engine didn't work, it was a one-shot deal. If it didn't work, the guys were not getting back home, and contingencies were for that. But it did, and it would dock back up with Michael Collins in the command module. They would transfer the crew, but also some samples. Even on Apollo 11, they gathered samples, nearly 50 pounds worth. They would leave whatever junk and excess stuff they had in the LEM. And then they would, again, uncrewed detach it and head back to Earth. Now a much lighter profile mission. And once they get back to Earth on July 24, right upon re-entry, they would separate from the service module, now spent. Basically, the capsule just had a few light thrusters, otherwise that was it, and a heat shield, the most important bit. And they would actually come in blunt-faced, burning up. It was an ablative heat shield, and splash down in the ocean successfully, carrying just this, of that huge Saturn V. Only this module would have returned home and gone to museums, along with the 3 astronauts and some rocks, and a little bit of gear, although a lot was left behind on the moon or in the LEM, which they had a few different fates. And a joke I've often made, although it's perfectly true, is man goes to another planet, and the first thing we do is litter. But that's just the original Apollo 11 G-type mission. We had others. In fact, originally there were going to be 10 moon landings, but that was cut down to 7, and of course in reality we had 6. But now let's go back to the moon and the equipment. Here's that Apollo astronaut in the A7L suit we saw in the last video. He's about a 1/24 scale. Pretty neat, about 3 inches, a little under. He's also from the Space Voyagers. And he's actually in the original suit variant. Later there would be the A7LB. But that's not really what we're going to talk about in this video. Instead, part 4 will actually be on not only the Apollo spacesuit, but all of them, from Mercury through the space station. But we saw him before, so I just wanted to mention him. So we went to the moon, and frankly, if it were only just a PR stunt, that would have been the end. Frankly, if the Soviets had done it, that probably would have been what happened at that time, because look at Voskhod 1 and 2. But America wanted to go 10 times, Apollos 11 through 20. Unfortunately, Vietnam War, other budget cuts, Congress, this was sliced down to Apollo 11 through 17. Again, Apollo 11, G. Apollo 12 was the first H-type mission. Now, this was a considered precision landing and somewhat longer duration. That was Apollo 12. So they did stay on the moon a little longer, actually having a rest period to note. And that gets us to kind of the internal volume. This little model here is actually from the Smithsonian Model Collection. This is an easy kind of snap together model, but kind of neat. Actually, you put it together with screws. But anywho, the room inside was not much. About 7.5 feet by 3.5 feet in a little compartment. about 160 cubic feet total. Like I said, about like Gemini. But since they are in gravity, even if low gravity, when they slept, they had to string up hammocks. And it took both men to get the A7L suit on inside. It was pretty cramped. Probably made the CSM feel spacious. So that was 12. 13 was supposed to be another H-type mission. Obviously, 13 didn't go to plan, but they came back with 14 with Al Shepard, and again landed on the moon for a third time. It's worth pointing out that in 13 and 14, they gave them a little bit of a golf cart to haul around gear, because they could carry gear, samples, and kind of excavation equipment and science packages, of course the flag and the descent stager. They also added stripes because to the commander, red stripes, because they started to use color television cameras, and they wanted to denote which guy was which on camera. But then we get to 15. Now, originally 15 was to be another H mission, but because of the cutbacks, it became the first J-type mission. Now, there was an I-type, but it was kind of compacted into J, because these were meant to be long-duration, extended missions for science. And I'm using this here because they also had to modify the LEM. It was called the Extended Lunar Module, the ELM. They gave it extra fuel. They also increased the bell here for the engine, for the extra weight. And this is kind of represented in this model a wee bit. Because this was heavier. Dry mass was a little under 11,000 pounds versus a little under 9,500 for the original LEM. And all up, the original was about 33,500, and this was over 36,000 pounds. And it could carry over 200 pounds of rocks back. And it had more oxygen, had enlarged fuel tanks, it had a waste tank added, because whereas the first LEM was 48 hours, this was meant to be 75 hours, so over 3 days, even if some of that was just, built-in margin. So heavier mass, everything. And like I said, with Apollo 14, they did some maneuvering with the CSM to give it a little more hover time to pick a good landing spot. But, that what they wanted to do with the 15s was a lot of science. So the mission profiles changed and expanded. There was a new version of the suit for longer excursions too, called the A7LB, and they actually would have 3 separate spacewalks, or I guess moonwalks, on Apollos 15, 16, and 17, which were the J-type missions, with 17 being the last. That actually means that the extended module first flew in July of 71, and the last one of any LEM flew December 1972. Very good record, even though the development was problematic and training was dangerous. Out of the 10 launched into space, there were no failures, no problems. It obviously served a very important role with Apollo 13 as a lifeboat that it was really never intended for. That goes to show you the just the great potential of this, the first spacecraft, even though it was basically disposable. No engine failures, because again, if this ascent engine had failed, and this does separate too. And what's neat, unlike the other ones, this also has the bell for the engine on the underside for the ascent. That's why I wanted to show you it separating. It's not articulated. It doesn't have moving legs or anything. So there's kind of pros and cons to each of these. And as you saw, it does sit on its stand quite well. There's a peg. Pretty neat. So that's it, right? That's all of our lunar missions. Apollos 18, 19, and 20 were canceled, although 18 effectively became the Apollo-Soyuz project in 1975, and because of the cancellation, this would actually lead to the ability to do Skylab, which was a Saturn V to launch the laboratory itself, and then three Saturn 1Bs to launch 3 expeditions to it in 1973 and 74. So the Apollo program morphed from what it originally was, a lunar landing, into kind of America's mid-70s space program until the shuttle was available. That's all right. There's nothing else to talk about with the J missions, right? Oh, you knew I was going to talk about it. The Lunar Roving Vehicle, LRV, or the Lunar Rover, or the Moon Buggy. And here's a little one from the Space Voyagers set. It's not to scale 1/144. Based on the guide, say it's close to 1/72. It's actually a die-cast, at least the base is. Here's a slightly larger one from that set from the Smithsonian models type. Comes mostly pre-assembled, although you do attach the stuff. And our driver here is actually removable, and he comes with the other crewman who's out. Interestingly, the dish is on this side for this one, and this side for this one. Both are kind of correct, depending on the model you have. Early on, the dish was on the right. Later on, it was moved, and the camera was flipped. And if that's not big enough, we also have this one from the Action Products Space Voyagers. And this is getting into about 1/18 scale. So essentially G.I. Joe sized. So take your pick as to little, medium, or big. The actual LRV was about 10 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, and at its tallest point, not counting the mast, stood about 3.5 feet, mostly counting like the equipment back here. And this was a very interesting vehicle. I guess it was, okay, what do we do next? We've gone to the moon, we've hung out there a couple of times, we've had a golf cart. Let's bring a car to the moon. That is very, very American. But this is a lightweight little buggy. It didn't start off that way, though. Initial concepts weren't for a moon buggy, rather a moon truck. And they go back to the 1950s, and a lot of prominent sci-fi writers, of course, but also scientists like von Braun talked about them. The idea was to actually have quite a armored, heavy vehicle that could be used for days and weeks on end, going around the moon, kind of a mobile base. And it was to be 7 up to 10,000 pounds, in concept. But that was back when they were thinking they were going to have 2 Saturn launches to assist Apollo and do all that. Well, when Congress kind of reined this in around 1964, they didn't give up hope. In fact, von Braun publicly said, we need a vehicle to get around. Otherwise, on foot, we're not going to get enough science done. They weren't able to science the shit out of things. Anyway, so they had to scale it back, way back. Several companies were already invested in this, including Boeing, who would actually go on to build the lunar roving vehicle, along with significant help from GM, who did most of the drivetrain and stuff. Other companies were invited and did submit designs, including Chrysler and Grumman, who had made the lunar lander. Kind of funny that different companies made all these, but no, the Boeing design with GM was selected. Now, this was kind of up in the air. In fact, it wasn't really officially announced they wanted designs, competition until May of '69, just before Apollo. And things weren't really progressed until late October, just before Apollo 12 launched in '69. That's when the design was kind of approved and things were done. And no pressure. You have to deliver it by April 1st, 1971. Because, hey, by that summer, we're going to be using it on Apollo, what would become Apollo 15, when everything was kind of folded in, the I's and the J's and all that. So this had to be and was actually designed in under a year and a half and built. And they would actually build 4 full working vehicles, plus plenty of test and training types. And they did it. And they did it on time, on budget, and it proved to be a very dependable vehicle. In fact, so much so that by the time of Apollo 17, some of the restrictions and safety margins were lifted because, well, things proved to work. But how did we get a car on the moon, especially in the lunar module itself, even the extended version that could lift more? Pretty neat construction. For weight, this is primarily made of aluminum tubing frame, and the seats also were tubing with webbing mesh to make the rest of the seat up. The tires were quite an advent. They were made out of titanium, tungsten, and kind of spun aluminum and steel, kind of a web tire. In fact, it was a patented new thing done at Boeing. And everything else is pretty lightweight and extendable. Obviously, the communications dish is mesh. We have a camera on the front, which could be dismounted. Before that, the Apollo camera, 35mm camera, was actually on a tripod. And we could carry equipment in the back. Soil collecting tools and put our rocks there and all that. So on Earth, the unloaded, just bare vehicle was about 460 pounds. But it was designed to carry more than twice its weight in cargo, getting the overall weight to 960 some odd pounds. Fuel, and well, not fuel, but astronauts and gear and whatever. Of course, on the moon, that would translate to 77 and 160 pounds respectively. It was designed to go about 6 miles per hour. In reality, it went faster, sometimes much faster, over 11 miles per hour once was the lunar speed record. Now, it had a range of nearly 60 miles, but this was kept to 30 miles for safety reasons in case it broke down, so the astronauts could come back. So they would usually drive all the way out and then trek back as they consumed their resources. This was powered with 2 non-rechargeable batteries. I should mention that the original LEM, I said had 6 batteries. The extended version had 7, kind of a similar thing. Each wheel had its own engine, and they could be unlinked if one failed and kind of tie it to the others if they needed to. Pretty basic steering, had kind of a handle. Forward to go, back was brake, including a parking brake. Can you imagine if your vehicle rolled off when you weren't in it on the moon? And of course, side to side to steer. There were some basic odometers and that kind of thing too, targeting systems. The commander was the driver. The pilot, LM pilot, again, wasn't really piloting. He was the navigator and really just observer, commenter. Sometimes if you listen to the Apollo tapes, a lot of commenting. This one's kind of neat because it does have the red stripes for the driver. Unfortunately, this is still the A7L, not the A7L suit variant. You can tell them apart by the few small things, but since it's a toy, take it for what it is. We'll get to that in the suit video. Although I think this guy might be wearing the B variant. Well, and like I said, placement of the camera and the communications dish actually moved around. And this is movable back here. You can separate the kind of storage thing. Everything had to be big so they could operate it with gloves on. So it's light, but how'd they fit it in the limb? Well, this was actually a sectional base. It hinged twice, so it folded over, kind of it was like a billfold. And some of the stuff had to be attached, but some of it was self-deploying. And all they had to do was store it in the descent stage in quadrant 1, and they basically pull the rope and get lowered to the ground and mostly self-extended. And the astronauts finished the rest and then drove it a safe distance with one on board, one not. And then once it was a safe distance from the landing site, both crew would get on board and go for a romp. And not only did it give them a little bit faster speed than walking, hey guys, working on the moon was really, really tiring. And so this made a lot of sense. This really let them collect more samples, go further, have more tools, and just conserve their energy. And it's just neat that it was kind of self-doing, because there's only limited things it could do with gloves on. I should say that this was used a total of 9 times. Different ones, of course. 3 per mission, and all 3 were left on the moon, of course. Again, we like to litter. And we're very, very successful. And it's just kind of a neat engineering thing. It is very simple, but it was very effective. Really, the only major problems had to do with the fenders. And that might not seem like such a big deal, except moon dust. On a couple of different missions, they had problems with the broken fenders and made various solutions. Yeah, that's the thing, working on a hostile environment. For example, with 15, they burned out the camera quickly by pointing it at the sun accidentally. Things like that happened, but of course each time they learned and improved and changed things, and each mission was a little better. For example, the updated A7LB suit had more articulation, so they could more bend at the waist. They still kind of sat in it a little reclined, like they were in a lazy boy, but the earlier suits couldn't really bend at the waist to speak of, and the newer ones could. That's why they actually had to move some of the hoses around. They also had to enlarge the backpack to provide more stuff, water, air. They even had a small energy bar they could munch on, because they were out there. The missions were 7 hours in some cases, so pretty impressive. And they went swimmingly well, including this little LRV. So good job, Boeing and GM. Of course, all the ones that are in museums today are, either display models. There was a 4th one made as a spare that was never used, so there is one live one existing, but of course the 3 that were used are still on the moon. Maybe one day we'll collect them, sorry guys. Trying to think what else to say about it, though. It is really an important vehicle, but you can check it out for yourself. As well as the actual mission logs. You can hear the audio recordings, not to mention see video and picture. It is in color now. And these were able to bring back over 230 pounds of moon rocks and whatnot for study. Some of them quite important. And really expanded the mission profile. They even did some kind of boring drilling geology. So, Armageddon's true? I don't know. But that's kind of what we did on the moon, guys. We were last there December 14, 1972. So, yeah, 50 years ago. And counting. But if the U.S. is to be believed, if NASA is to be believed, we'll be going back. I'd like to see that. Well, okay, hear about it. But I also will believe it when it actually happens, because we've been kind of teased with this moon thing before. And that was Apollo on the moon. So which of these do you kind of like? This one's neat for how small it is. This one, so even though it's all plastic, it's got a good bit of detail. Because the figure is removable. And this one, well, it's more of a toy, but still pretty neat. Now, I looked on eBay and people are asking $100 for these. That's crazy. I picked this one up for $30. New in the box. It comes with one astronaut. I had a second one, so I put him in. These are kind of neat. They're somewhat articulated. The arms move in one place. The legs move in two each. Keep in mind the original suited astronauts weren't exactly terribly dexterous either. And you can remove the camera off the front. And you can rotate the dish. Action product stuff's kind of amusing. And like I said, you can also remove the tool box in the back here. The wheels move. But that'll be for part 4. We'll talk about the suits and my action figures here of space guys because they were shockingly difficult to find. Not very expensive, but just difficult to find. That's for next time. For this time, that gets us through all the missions. Again, there was also Skylabs 1 through 4, with 1 just being the unmanned vehicle launch, laboratory launch. And then we had Apollo Soyuz, sometimes called Apollo 18. And that was it. 1975 ended the Apollo program. It had some setbacks, Apollo 1. And of course, Apollo 13 was an interesting event. But all in all, quite successful. We were able to get 6 landings, 12 people on the moon. And the last ones were quite extensive. Really going up against the duration for the extended lunar module and the vehicle and the A7LB suit. We really did push to the limit in 1972 because they knew that would be it for a long time. And as it happened, that was probably a good call. We even got an actual scientist on the moon. Believe it or not. And this really was what started to transform NASA and the space program from an offshoot of the military, even though it was civilian, and test pilots and all that, to more science and education. Something that continued into the 80s and the shuttle program and so on and so forth. But that was Apollo. So that's my 3 parts specifically on it. And part 4 will be kind of jumping off here and going back to Mercury, Gemini, and forward to the space shuttle's space suits. So I appreciate you hanging out. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I do. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time. Also, yes, the moon landings were real. The conspiracy stuff, maybe I'll do a black box on that. Why not?